My immigrant is my grandma, Anne McNeil. She came to Canada and the US from Belfast, Northern Ireland. She was adopted as a baby and never knew her parents. Growing up in Northern Ireland was a tough experience for her. Northern Ireland was under British control, and Ireland was its own independent state. Also, Ireland was Christian and Northern Ireland was Protestant, which fueled tensions. Ireland wanted Northern Ireland to join their nation and be independent from British rule, but the North refused. The Irish Civil War from 1922 to 1923 was fought over whether or not Northern Ireland would join the newly independent Ireland as part of its free nation. The end of the war saw Northern Ireland remaining under British control, but there was still lots of animosity between the two sides. Also, the IRA was a constant source of fear for the people of Northern Ireland and Britain. The IRA was the Irish Republican Army, and they used guerrilla warfare and terrorist methods during the Civil War and after it to gain an advantage over the British. It was under this shadow of warfare that my grandmother grew up, to the extent that when a plane flew by, they all ran out of the house in fear. In the war's aftermath, it was also very difficult to get jobs in Ireland, which led to my grandmother's family not having the best living conditions. There was no running water, no refrigeration, and a radio was the only source of her family's communication with the outside world. My grandma and her family's move to Canada and the US was also fueled by my grandmother being adopted. There's a stigma against adopted people in Ireland, mainly stemming from Christians not wanting a baby that was Protestant, and vice versa. All of these factors motivated my grandmother and her family to get out of Ireland. So they did. When my grandma was 9, her and her family took a boat from Belfast, Northern Ireland, to the port of Nova Scotia in Canada. The boat ride was miserable for most of its duration for my grandma. Her and her family had never been on a boat, and they got terribly seasick. They also had to sleep below decks and never got much fresh air. One nice memory my grandma had from the ride was that on the last day before reaching Nova Scotia, the ship's captain threw a party on the boat to celebrate. There was dancing and music and laughter, but my grandma's favorite memory of that night was when she tried lemonade for the first time. She thought it was a fancy drink and never really had anything but water and milk in Ireland, and it was a really special night for her as a 9-year-old girl. When they landed in Canada, they went to Halifax and then took a train to Ontario, where my grandma's dad was already there waiting for them. They then met up in Ontario and went to a town called Pickering Beach, where they bought a house. In Pickering Beach, they were friends with a family called the McNeils, who had traveled before them from Ireland to Canada and lived with them in Ireland too. My grandma later married one of them, who was my grandpa. His name was Ken McNeil. In Canada, my grandma had access to education for the first time, and it was a tough transition for her in a new country, having to go to school. But she also remembers being more happy in Canada than in Ireland. In Canada, they had an icebox for refrigeration, and a TV, and running water. My grandma and her family were really increasing their quality of life, and that was great for them. My grandma's parents found some good working opportunities, and they had a nice life in Canada. Then, my grandma married my grandpa, Ken McNeil, and they moved to the US for better working opportunities. My grandpa went ahead with his family, and my grandma took the immigration test and interview. She was nervous, but she passed both and was accepted into the US. My grandma met up with my grandpa in Long Beach, where he worked as a mechanic at Disneyland. My grandma said that the biggest difference between Canada and the US was the houses. She said that in California there were houses of pink and white, and it was sunny and there were palm trees. And in Canada the houses were brick, and it was cold. They moved from California to Ohio because my grandma got a better job there working for General Motors, and now they had 6 mouths to feed, one of them being my dad. When they were in Ohio, they wanted to make money, and they wanted to do this in any way they could, and the computer business was really taking off at this point. So my grandpa decided, pretty out of the blue, that they were going to start a computer company in their garage. They went into debt $10,000, got a couple of suppliers for parts, and started advertising to anyone they could that they could make a computer with any part that anyone wanted. And whenever somebody called and they asked for something, my grandpa said, "Yes, we have that, and I'll make it, no matter what, even if he had no idea what he was making." He learned pretty quickly almost everything about building computers and computer parts, and eventually his clients got bigger and bigger, and he sold computers to most of the colleges in the country. Eventually, he sold the company and moved back to California with my grandma and their family, where my grandma lives to this day. My grandma says she's very grateful for the whole experience of moving from Ireland to Canada to the US, and she thinks it changed her life for the better, and that was an amazing opportunity for her.